Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to The Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome in everyone to The Hoon, which at the moment is a single Hoon. I'm Bernard Hickey, co-host, with our other co-host, Peter Bale, perhaps at this moment dialing in from perhaps a car in Wellington before he zips across the Cook Strait to have a weekend at the Nelson Lakes. And sometimes the car from the car isn't quite as reliable technically as it can be. So we'll bring Peter in if he arrives, but that's not a problem because we've got plenty of interesting guests this week to talk about news around Aotearoa and the rest of the world, on politics, the economy, climate change, geopolitics, housing, and poverty, because there's been plenty of news this week here and overseas. First up, we'll be talking to Catherine Dyer, our regular commentator on climate issues, dialing in from Wellington, where she lectures on climate change at Victoria University of Wellington. And we'll talk about some of the latest surveys showing what people think about how to deal with climate change, and also some new studies showing just how expensive it is not to address climate change and not to have some consistent climate change policies. We'll talk then with Professor Elaine Monahan from Indiana University, a regular guest on the show, who looks at America's political scene closely and follows geopolitics as a former Reuters reporter correspondent and now a professor in journalism at Indiana University. Plenty going on in the world of geopolitics, plenty that might be about to happen. In Iran, there's the biggest armada the United States has ever taken to the Middle East in decades, loitering, and Donald Trump says that he may go to war with Iran because they're doing some sinister things with nuclear. We'll find out, no doubt, in the next week or two what's going on there. Overnight, there were fresh talks between Iran and the United States. And of course, the State of the Nation address from Donald Trump, in which he said many things for a very long time, which perhaps were interesting, but certainly we're at a delicate point in the political cycle, and plenty happening around the world in terms of tariffs, geopolitics, and the great contest between the United States and China at the least. And in New Zealand, plenty also happening in our politics, where we've got some fresh polls as we're 9 months out now from the election on November the 7th. We've got some fresh news too. The government chose this week to announce it planned to give police the power to move on homeless people in our main cities, effectively forcing them to move away from shop fronts, out from doorways for at least a day, under threat of a $2,000 fine, which most people who are homeless couldn't pay. And if you can't pay, you go to prison for 3 months at a cost of nearly $600 a night, compared to around $200 a night, which is the cost that homeless people were incurring in motels before the government announced a policy last year of removing people from hotels, which has been remarkably successful and fast in achieving the government's aim of reducing spending on motels, but it's also increased homelessness in our streets. And we'll talk to Professor Polly Atatoa Carr from the Institute for Population Research at Waikato University to find out more about that move on order, and also what's happening with with Housing First, a really interesting program. That's a lot's happening um, in Hamilton. Now, I think we can welcome Peter Bale to the show, co-host Peter Bale from the Kaka on the Kaka.
In the car. Yes, Bernard. Can you hear me all right?
I can, and I can
Yeah,
see you
and
too.
I'm terribly sorry, but there's classically I left Auckland a little bit later than I should have, and the West Taupo Road has very poor reception until you get to Turangi. So I'm in Turangi, 5G, 5 bars. Here I am. How are you?
Oh, fantastic!
And
Lovely to
sorry,
see you.
it literally is just on time delivery.
Good. Know the feeling. And I am thrilled that you made it on. As you can probably tell, I've just finished with the preview
Yes.
of the show. We've got Elaine Monaghan ready to join us from Indiana University to talk about geopolitics after we've spoken to Catherine. And it's
Mm.
been a busy old week in our politics and economy, but also
So, Bernard,
plenty
have you got a couple of Swifties for the stories you think we should track? Is that what you? Because I didn't get you to send you a script today.
No, that's okay. We've got Catherine Dyer on at
Mm.
5:10 to talk about the latest in climate policy. Elaine, obviously, joining us to talk about State of the Union address from Donald Trump and what's happening in politics there ahead of the
Hmm.
midterms. And then we've got a special guest in from the Waikato University, Professor Polly Atatoa-Ka, to talk about the Move On orders. She's studied the Housing First programs that are running in New Zealand,
Good.
which she'll be able to tell us a bit more about some of the issues around these Move On orders, but also some of the successes of the Housing First
Mm.
policies, which are great. And no, it's going to be a cracking show. What stood out for you this week in the world of geopolitics, Peter?
Well, I'm hoping that Elaine is going to talk to us quite a lot about the truly bizarre Castro-esque State of the Union speech, just under 2 hours, completely barking mad. If there wasn't an argument for the 25th Amendment, then that's it. And the 25th Amendment is the one where the fellow cabinet members say this guy's bonkers, we've got to take over. But it was also, and this again will be very good for Elaine to talk to because of her experience in Russia and at the fall of the Soviet Union, it was a very kind of Stalin-esque proposal. There's a famous story about Stalin where people kind of would clap the skin off their hands because they didn't want to be the first one to stop clapping, and it is an extraordinary thing. So that's been on my mind, Bernard. I'm intrigued, but not much has changed since last week in this situation where we have now 50% of the mobile forces of the United States, particularly the Air Force, are now in the theater that could be used for an attack on Iran. And
Wow.
so once you move that kind of structure, it's very hard to go. So those are my two big stories. But just on a media level story too, may I just mention something, Bernard? An old colleague of ours from Reuters died yesterday, a 69-year-old woman, reporter, Roxana Dascălu, who was a Romanian journalist who worked for me or with me in the early 1990s, joined Reuters in '89 as the Ceausescu regime was falling. And I wanted just to pay a slight tribute to her because she worked for Reuters for 10 years, then went on to become an activist. But she's the kind of person that we no longer have, in a sense. She was at Rompress, the state news agency under Ceausescu, which meant that she had to have a military rank in the Securitate at that time, the Secret Service. She used to be responsible for censoring internal foreign magazines, so she was incredibly well read, spoke 6 languages fluently. And then the moment the revolution came, the great Christmas revolution of Ceausescu, she joined Reuters and was immediately incredibly valuable to Reuters, highly trustworthy. Her husband joined as well. And she's the kind of person that really marked that transition in Eastern Europe from what were called Z-men, people who'd had a kind of communist background and were highly intelligent, and they kind of had this extraordinary life flip into being super high quality journalists, who told the stories of their own countries, but also of the entire transition. So I just want to pay tribute to Roxana, who died of natural causes yesterday.
Well, sad
but a
to hear
little bit,
that.
but a lot too early.
Yeah, it strikes me regularly now, Peter. Having worked overseas for Reuters as well, mostly in what you'd call Western democratic places, but I did spend a bit of time in Asia and
Mm,
countries where not everything is open and free, and not everyone can talk to you. And often there's big pictures of the leader, the dear leader, beaming down from some high place in public areas, and often repeatedly. It was disconcerting to see this week that Donald Trump's uh, um, beaming visage, or maybe often it's an angry
oh,
visage, was hanging from the walls of the Department of Justice in the United States. And it strikes me that a lot of the skills that you have as a journalist, and you mentioned Ceausescu's Romania, are ones that we take for granted and think are, not really needed in a Western democracy. You ring up and ask a politician for something, and we
mm,
expect them to try to tell the truth. And if they don't, they'll get kicked out of power, or that when you report on something, you're not going to be put in prison
mm.
or worse. But we're starting to see this sort of stuff happen in places you wouldn't expect.
Well, of course, we also had the re-election of Kim Jong Un as the
Oh, that was a
leader of
surprise.
Korea. I know, incredible surprise. I mean, a pretty high rate of votes, I think. So yeah, I want to talk to when we get Elaine on about that. Now, you and I were talking that we might have a little bit of a stoush as well, you and
I'll go
me,
for it. Yes, please.
because
Let's do it
I
now.
was absolutely appalled this week, as were the dark right wing. Nasty branch New Zealanders who I follow on Twitter quite a lot, X quite a lot, by the decision of the Clerk of the Houses of Parliament to unilaterally take the Houses of Parliament off X. Now, I don't think he should have been allowed to do that by himself. Winston Peters, who I seldom agree with, absolutely doesn't think he should. And it seems to have followed a piece by Andrea Vance, which is very influential of her to have done this, talking about the grok nakedness pictures and all of this stuff. And I just think it's absolutely ridiculous that a civil servant would have the power to take Parliament off a social network that has something like between 600 and 900,000 New Zealanders on it without some discussion in Parliament or the imprimatur of Jerry Brownlee. And I don't think there's been enough reporting of it. And what reporting there has been pretty dark and on the right wing. And it just feeds this notion that the media is in the pocket of the government and that the government is anti-free speech. So
Yeah.
there you go.
No, thank you, Peter. I respectfully disagree.
Yeah, it's
uh,
all right.
because I think X is a toxic hellscape. I haven't looked at it now for years, and
Hmm.
my life has gone on perfectly fine without it. We didn't have X, I bet you there was no X in Romania when you were out there reporting. Not that I'm suggesting we should go back to that, but um, it it uh, it is a toxic, dangerous place, and I'm now of the view that social media uh, should be, if not removed completely, then certainly controlled aggressively, because it's a toxic, dangerous vehicle for misinformation and disinformation. Having seen what happened during COVID in New Zealand, where
Hmm.
Russian troll farms pumped disinformation into New Zealand at a greater rate than any other country. And within months, I saw people parading Russian flags
Yes.
down Lambton Quay before the most awful sit-in protests around
Yeah,
Parliament.
but it's interesting, Bernard. Many of the people who are complaining about the actions of this clerk of the House, and I haven't seen him speak publicly. I think he needs to speak publicly. I'm incredibly surprised that Winston Peters hasn't insisted yet that he does. But they're drawing that linkage, though, between the hosing down and the music that was played to the protesters, the disrespect to the protesters, and that this is another signal of disrespect to a small but significant and quite influential bunch of grumpy people. I was also noted, and I almost never agree with the guy Stephen Franks, who I think is still the chairman of the Free Speech Union. And I had to send him a note and just say, I can't believe I agree with you on this. So, these kinds of incidents create very strange bedfellows. And I know where you stand on this, Bernard, but I did want to, I mean, it's a good example of where we differ. I noticed Bryce Edwards, who's doing pretty well with his incredibly long daily commentaries, but he took the same view I did. I think that this is a disenfranchisement. I hope Simon gets to edit that one. Disenfranchisement of a certain segment, while still recognizing your attitude about X and other parts of social media.
I'd try getting off X for a few months and just see how life is after that. I think we'd all live much better off without it. I certainly, from a productivity point of view and a mental health point of view, I think the world would be much better off without it. But I'm really thrilled to see Catherine
There's
Dyer.
Dr. Catherine Dyer. Yeah.
Yes.
Cool.
Dial in from sunny kia ora, from sunny and dry Wellington. I'm just stating it as a fact because that's what I would like to think. Catherine, lovely to see you here today. Firstly, I'm interested because I'm of the economic financial bent, and I'm always thinking about things through that lens. But I'm really interested in how climate change is affecting the world's economy, and often is actually the world's economy is the vehicle through which we experience climate change through rising prices and cost of living. But could you talk a bit more about some interesting research showing what happens when you have inconsistent climate policies and what that does for the global economy?
Yeah, so there's this really interesting paper that just came out recently, macroeconomic paper that looks at exactly that question. It was based mostly on the US, but the results you could generalize about them. And what they basically found is that policy uncertainty in the US had a really negative effect on the economy. So that means that when policy direction became unpredictable, you ended up with a fall in industrial production, you had employment figures rise, you had private investment dropping, and those figures were all higher for companies that had high exposure to climate change. And what they found with that mechanism is that it didn't work like other kinds of economic policy uncertainty. It was very specific to climate change policy uncertainty, and it acted more like supply shocks in the economy rather than demand shocks. So you had that reduction in output and production and all those sort of things. And what happened is because it had inflationary impacts, then monetary policy could not really be used to address it because you would have spikes in inflation. So instead, it just made the economy contract. And perversely, so this was resulting from cutting of existing climate policies. So perversely, the effect of that shrinking economy actually reduced emissions, but it did it at a huge economic cost.
That's
so
one way to.
Basically, it says cutting climate policy. The conclusion was that cutting climate policies in order to promote growth does not work at all. In fact, it had the complete opposite effect in reality.
Yeah, and another economic concept we think about with climate change is the social cost of carbon. And I wondered if you could talk through a new paper that's come through that looks at the social cost of carbon, how high it is, and why you need to respond to it.
So this was another macroeconomic paper that came out in the last couple of months. And this is really fascinating because in this study, they changed the way they measure the economic impact of temperature changes. So what's happened to date with what economists have done is they've looked at temperature shocks at a country level and said, well, what did that increase in temperature do to the economy? And then they aggregate those to get a global number. And then they translate that global number into a social cost of carbon, which is how much did the how much did, when we increased the amount of carbon, how much cost did that have to the total economy? And so what they did in this study is they said, well, actually, the drivers of really expensive economic events are extreme weather events, and those aren't driven by local temperature increases. Those are driven by global temperature increases. And in fact, in the study, what they found is that it's not even surface air temperature that drives extreme weather events. It's more like ocean temperature, which is very steadily increasing over time. And so when they changed the way they measured it, they measured global temperature shocks instead of local temperature shocks, and looked at the economic impact of those. It was an entire order of magnitude higher than the kind of results that they've gotten in the past. And the things that they looked at that produce these global temperature spikes or shocks are actually things like solar cycles and volcanic eruptions and El Nino, which you'll notice none of those are climate change caused events, but they do at a global level produce these temperature spikes. And so those you can look at to see, well, what's the impact of that temperature spike on the economy? And then we can translate that into looking what a steady increase in temperature. So they found that a 1 degree temperature increase results in a 20% lower global GDP than it would have otherwise. And interestingly, they also say that has already happened. So the current global GDP is 20% lower now than it otherwise would have been if it wasn't for
Good Lord. That's gigantic.
Climate change.
That's a gigantic number.
It's a gigantic number, and under moderate warming scenarios, by the end of the century, by 2100, they're saying that the number is 50% drop in what GDP would have been otherwise. And so the social cost of carbon, the number that they have for that is $1,200 per tonne. And one of the interesting things that they also found from that is that when you look at a big country like the US, what they often say is, if we spend all this money on decarbonisation strategies, a lot of the benefit from that is global. So all the costs are local, but the benefits are global. And if we only count the local benefits, then it's not worth doing, so we won't do it. And under this study, what they're saying, well, that completely changes, because for large countries like the US and China and the EU, even if you only look at the domestic cost of carbon, those decarbonisation strategies are now worth doing, according to this calculation. So even if you don't care about global coordination, if you don't have a moral, decision to try and do something about it, even if all you care about is the impact on your country, it is worth doing for big countries. And of course, big countries have the power to make it worth doing for small countries.
And just finally, Catherine, an interesting survey.
Well, you think it's final, Bernard. I've got another one to slip to her. Yeah.
Just finally from me, at least, an interesting survey result out this morning in the Post from Freshwater, sponsored by the Infrastructure New Zealand, and which showed that New Zealand voters actually quite like mega projects, unlike the Infrastructure Commission's view that we need to do a lot more small projects. But interestingly, they're not so interested in motorways. They'd prefer to see rail, and they'd really like to see climate responses, so flood protection work, those sorts of things.
Yeah, this is so interesting. It's something about the wisdom of crowds, right? So people of New Zealand in general, would prefer to see the government do things that are more about mitigation and adaptation. They want to see more flood protection measures. They want to see investment in railways and things like that. And that's quite heartening to see that they understand those things. But I also think it's a response to the level of risk shifting that is currently going on. This is something that a sociologist from Germany called Ulrich Beck used to talk about a lot. World Risk Society called it. And he said that there was a lot of risk shifting that goes on around things like climate change. And so what we're seeing at the moment is a lot of institutions in New Zealand, whether it's the finance industry, the insurance industry, and the government itself, they're very, very focused on trying to maintain their own institutional stability. and they're doing that by shifting risk away from themselves and onto individuals. So that's you and me, right? So there's a massive program of risk shifting going on at the moment. One of my students that I've been supervising over the summer break has been doing a project on this. So shout out to Maria Burns, which has shown this really strongly across those three institutions, that they're really focused on their institutional stability. And I think that people generally are starting to understand the fact that the risks of climate change are being shifted onto them personally. And so they're now very much interested in seeing, well, what is the government going to do about that? Because, if you have been structurally encouraged to invest all of your wealth into your home, for instance, and the government has encouraged that with tax-free capital gains on housing, it has also allowed a lot of building of housing to happen on floodplains, and so all of these things are about the way policy and regulation is being structured has increased the risk profile of people. And now the government's saying, well, in order to stay fiscally solvent ourselves, we're not going to assume any of the risk that comes from that. We're going to shift it onto you personally. And if as most of middle New Zealand, their entire wealth is tied up in their home, you could be impoverished overnight if the insurance doesn't cover you and a big, climate event happens. And it also has big implications for equity in terms of the fact that the effects of that risk shifting are much, much harder and stronger on people who are low income or who are more vulnerable.
Yes, that's going to be the game, if you like, and it is only a game, really. We're all going to be hit by it, but it's a matter of trying to avoid the state essentially shifting the risk, not just the state, but there's plenty of insurers who are doing that as well. Catherine, thank you so much for coming on to the show, and we welcome in Professor Elaine Monaghan. Great to see you on the show.
Hi, it's lovely to be back.
Elaine, terrific to see you, and very nice cans on your
What
ears.
did you say?
Very nice cans, as we say in broadcasting. Hey, now we were just talking to Catherine about weather, and I know climate is not weather, but you're in Indiana or in Washington?
I am currently in Indiana.
And so you're experiencing quite a spectacular set of storms, are you?
Well, not today, actually. It's quite spring-like today, but yes, we have had quite dramatic weather recently. I had my closest brush with a tornado yet the other day.
Oh my God, we're not in Texas, we're not in Kansas now.
No, and I was actually making a phone call on behalf of a friend for a job reference, and I literally had to deliver said reference from under the table in my basement.
Good look. And do you have a tornado shelter downstairs?
Well, I mean,
or is that the basement?
It's just the basement. It's the place where you can kid yourself on that you'll be fine.
Yeah. So, Elaine, where we also want to kid ourselves that we're going to be fine is I think you watched Fidel's nearly 2-hour State of the Nation last night. Tell us how that was to watch. I mean, I've watched clips of it, and it's one of those classic ones where it looks bonkers if you turn off the sound, and then it's even more bonkers when you turn the sound on.
It was definitely, to use your favorite word, quite bonkers. It was 100 and hang on a second. I'm trying to do the math. It was 1 hour and 41 minutes long, which was, I think, 21 minutes longer than the last record, which was Bill Clinton. So I think he was actually just trying to bore us to death. So that was his first crime, as far as I was concerned.
And it was also just spectacular digressions, right, into the men's hockey team, into abusing people. You know, it was just pretty weird, wasn't it? I mean, give us your review of it, please.
Well, I mean, I was obviously waiting for him to kind of go off script, because that's when things get even more bonkers than usual. And he didn't. So that was a sort of a disappointment, if only from an entertainment standpoint, because he kind of stuck to the real theme, which obviously his people had been telling him to talk about the economy. And he did more or less stick to that, while exaggerating obviously all over the place and misstating numbers the way he usually does, although not as extravagantly as he sometimes does. And he shook hands with the Supreme Court justices, which was an upgrade.
Four of them turned up, right?
Yes, that's right. Which was an upgrade, and he referred to their vote on the tariffs as a very unfortunate ruling.
As opposed to they're all
as
mad,
opposed to,
and I'm going to ignore them.
well, he had previously referred to them as fools, lapdogs, and rhinos, and said they were barely invited to the State of the Union. So that was definitely an upgrade. I mean, he did.
Are we worried
complain.
about his state of? Did it make you more or less worried about his state of mind?
Well, the truth is, he showed remarkable strength for a gentleman of his age, I would say, and reputed state of health. It's quite remarkable that anyone could deliver a speech that long, and I did wonder how that could be, but he got through the whole thing. So,
and Elaine, the other thing, Bernard and I were talking about it at the top of the show. Have you been in the background for a while? On the green room for a while?
Yes, I have.
Yeah. So
yes, I've been listening in.
We talked at the top of the show about the enormous poster of Trump in one of those kind of ludicrously aggressive pictures. I think it's the one that he put out after the Georgia arraignment over the attempts to steal votes there. And it hangs now sort of like a giant Stalin-esque Nazi or Nazi symbol down the front of the Justice Department. That must have, with your experience in Eastern Europe and Russia in particular, that must have raised a few little alarms there, didn't it?
Well, I mean, yes, and I mean, compared to what happened in Minneapolis just recently, it just feels like another little blip on the horizon. I mean, I have to be honest that the first time I saw Washington, D.C., I felt like the entire mall area kind of fit the description you just described. So in a way, but yes, obviously,
yeah, but it didn't have pictures of the then posters of the then president. No,
did not have enormous. So yes, in that sense, we're in a completely different territory now. And I'll be honest that I was up in the DC area for a month over winter break, and I really did avoid that part of the downtown area because I just don't need to see it. Thank you.
And Elaine, I interviewed. I'll send you a copy of the story because I don't think I have yet, and people will be rolling their eyes. But the good thing is I can't see their YouTube comments today. I interviewed M. Gesson the other day, and she said one of the great ways to excuse me, M. Gesson. They said one of the extraordinary ways to see whether the United States is becoming authoritarian, becoming authoritarian, and they did use the word fascism, was in the aesthetics, the demolition of the East Wing, and these posters and so on. What's your take on it at the moment? Would you use the F word or the authoritarian word?
Well, I funnily enough was actually talking about M. Gesson's article in my classroom today. I mean, it's
this
very
is
hard.
M. Gesson's article on the 4th anniversary of Ukraine, right?
Correct.
Yeah, we'll come back to you on that one because we're going to come back to you on Ukraine. Okay. Please carry on.
Stick to the topic is what you're telling me.
No, just because poor old Simon has to edit them together.
No, I mean, yes. I mean, look, obviously, Gesson's depiction of these things is based on, real knowledge and real historian's eye and lived experience on their part. And I mean, one of the most sort of shocking, I think I'm still most shocked in terms of this aesthetic by the destruction of the East Wing and the White House. Because that represents the First Lady's part of the building, and to me that just feels rather obviously like a kind of removal of one half of the significance of one half of the population, which given how he talks about women, we shouldn't be surprised by. But that just felt like a really shocking moment, especially when seen in the context of the Epstein files, which of course we're all talking about nonstop, and still not fully understanding them. So.
And Elaine, you were a former Reuters correspondent in Kyiv and in Moscow. What's your and also you've been working very heavily for Reuters for much of the, I don't think you are at the moment editing, but for much of the this period you've been part of a really remarkable global virtual desk running the copy out of Ukraine and Moscow to pull it all together. What's your reflection on 4 years? I think on last Tuesday of 4 years since the full-scale invasion?
I mean, just so hard to find the words to describe how I feel about that. I mean, I've not been in Ukraine since before the war, And it'd been quite a few years before that. But obviously, you and I both have friends covering that war on the ground. And what I was doing was, a very safe sitting at a distance behind my laptop, at least giving our colleagues a chance perhaps to get more sleep than they might otherwise. But certainly, I mean, it's, I guess, we've seen enough conflicts around the world and, covered enough and read about enough to know that sometimes, the most awful circumstances can simply continue until, through just sheer lack of political will. And I, there's plenty of will, but there doesn't seem to be a way. And certainly the fact that it barely came up in the, 100 and however many minutes it was long speech yesterday, from a president who claimed he was going to end the war. I can't remember exactly how quickly he promised to do it.
A day, I think it was, and it would never have started if, and it never would have started if he'd been the president then.
Had he only been in charge, yes.
One of the good stories about this 4th anniversary was a really good one. I think it was maybe in the New York Times as well, possibly the Guardian, saying, "Oh, actually, just let me say, everybody should look at Sean Walker's piece, huge piece in the Guardian about how Ukraine has, how it prepared for war or didn't, and then how it's sustained itself." But there was a comment this week, Elaine, that Ukrainians were getting really sick of being told that they were resilient.
Oh yes.
What did that make you think when you saw that? That because you know the people there very well, or the culture.
Yeah, I mean, my experience of Ukrainians is that they are, resourceful is the word I would use. That was my experience of people, and also just incredibly friendly and literate and educated and fabulous, and yes, absolutely resourceful in that way that people are, where they're making do, and you see that in the war, of course, with the drone warfare that they're using and so on. But yes, I mean, Gessen's piece really does give us a very strong and sobering understanding of the psychology of what it means for people from that part of the world to have a war that has lasted for 4 years, because that is how long the Soviets were fighting the Nazis during what they called the Great Patriotic War. And so 4 years had this special significance. And I wrote down this line from Gessen's piece, as the being the age that Gessen is, and the co-author in that piece, who's a Ukrainian, they wrote, "In our generation, the future as a category continued to be suspect." This idea that, things are so bad that even thinking about the future is not an option. You can only live through minute by minute the reality that you can't ever stop thinking about the war.
And Elaine, do you think that the war will still be going on this time next year?
I mean, my goodness, I hope not. But if past is prologue, I mean, I don't even know what to say. I can only hope that it is not. What do you think, Peter?
I don't think that Witkoff and Kuchner are qualified to do the Witkoff is qualified to do the negotiations on this, but it'll take a huge lift for the European Union although they are doing it, of course. The money is now coming from the European Union and not from the United States. But I don't know. Elaine, it's really great to have had you on. We're going to discuss New Zealand homelessness now, and the idea that the government has told people to move on into where we don't know, but Polly is going to tell us. Bernard, would you take on Polly, please?
Yes,
thanks, Elaine.
Thank you very much, Elaine. Thanks, Peter. We'd like to welcome into the show a new guest, Associate Professor Polly Atatoa-Ka, who works with the Tinaida Institute for Population Research at Waikato University. Polly, thank you very much for jumping on.
Kia ora, you're welcome.
Now, this week is a big one in our debate around homelessness, housing, and how we treat people who, are sleeping in doorways or under bridges or whatever it is. On Sunday, the government announced it planned to legislate to give police the power to, quote, move on people who are just homeless in our CBDs for at least a day. And if they didn't, they risked a $2,000 fine or 3 months in prison. What did you think of this announcement?
Well, I think it's really important that we understand the pathways to homelessness. And so, what we understand from our research and from the work of Housing First collectives and other here in Aotearoa is that while the pathways to homelessness are complex, there are some really common key themes. And some of those themes are being in debt. And our research found that actually being in debt to government agencies is a really common theme. So finding people because they have nowhere else to be is only going to exacerbate that problem. We also know that there's particular challenges for those who are coming out of prison or who've had really complex lives. And so, therefore, this approach includes the possibility of imprisonment. So, we know that that's only going to exacerbate the situation. And we also know that punitive approaches, criminalising the experience of homelessness, doesn't work. What we know that works is things like strengths based approaches. We know providing secure and stable housing not only works to reduce the levels of the experience of homelessness in society, but also improves the ability for people to have jobs, to not need hospitalisation or emergency department attendance. And all of these things actually save the government money. We also know that pathways to homelessness are more common in societies where there is unequal treatment and differences between the haves and the have-nots. And these kind of punitive criminalising approaches set up the experience of homeless to be a kind of othering approach, which increases our distance, our inequalities in our society, which we know has a poor effect on antisocial behaviour, on criminal behaviour, on all of the other things that these policies are supposedly intending on targeting. So I think we should be doing something from a very different approach, and I think we should be doing things that we know work.
Yeah, one of those things is Housing First, which has been very active in Hamilton, and you've done a lot of research on that. Could you tell us about Housing First and the successes we've seen so far, albeit at a limited scale in New Zealand?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Housing First was a model started in the United States and adapted here, as you say, for the first time, in fact, in Kirikiriroa Hamilton by the People's Project, which I've had the real pleasure of collaborating with over the years. That was over 10 years ago that they started a Housing First approach here in Kirikiriroa Hamilton. And really, the premise of Housing First is as exactly as it says, you house people first. You provide that secure and stable environment in a housing approach that works for that person that you're working with. And then once that secure and stable housing is provided, you then can wrap around services because people haven't got that constant instability and stress around them. They have somewhere secure and stable to be. And then we know that that means that it's more likely that we have mental health services access, that we have hospitalisations reduced, that we have people who are able now to work and requiring less benefit.
Polly,
Just what,
we had an experiment of this to some extent with the Labour government's really enormous investments in Kaingaora, which was almost, or at least part of Kaingaora was sort of founded on the Housing First principle. And I wrote a story about it a couple of years ago for the Listener, and it just seems to have been absolutely, I mean, decimated, as if we take decimated literally of killing 1 in 10, they killed quite a lot more than that. What do you think about the politics of the destruction of Kaingaora and then this criminalization, or this word, the two words, move on, so that Frankie and Marina don't come across people outside the Louis Vuitton shop in Queen Street?
Look, I think, as you say, we're taking an enormous leap backwards, and a leap backwards into a world that we know actually doesn't gain the outcomes that we've required. The Housing First approach in Hamilton, for example, was started because of concerns around business owners when the Cricket World Cup was coming to Hamilton. So it's exactly the same kind of conversations that we're having now, business owners being concerned about the environment around their doorstep. And when you ask the question around kāinga ora, I think if we look at the successes that we've made using the housing first approach and the gains that we've made towards housing people, what we're seeing at the same time is some real failures in kāinga ora, in social housing in Aotearoa. So if you provide more housing first places on the one hand, but if you squeeze the eligibility for emergency housing or transitional housing or kāinga ora, or the ability to stay in kāinga ora, we know we're seeing increased terminations of kāinga ora tenancies. You really can't do these two things at the same time if you actually want the outcomes that you say that you want.
Polly, I'm
Polly,
curious. Thank you. I'm curious, Polly, about what we could do now if we used resources that are there to solve this issue. Now, the government has last year, when this really started to brew up as the number of homelessness people increased in almost direct relationship to the emptying of the motels, the government said, right, well, we'll fund an extra 300 places in Housing First. And some of those have been funded. And miraculously, the number of places that have opened up in Housing First seem to match the fall in homelessness that we've seen, that's been reported this week in Auckland. It's not exactly clear it's a one-for-one, but it's there. We have 100,000 people who are in need of housing, according to the census. What sort of things, if we were serious about this, if this was like a wartime situation and you just drop everything to fix it, which I think we should, but what sort of things should we do, could we do?
Look, that's a really great question. And I think I come back to my original discussion that what we should be doing should be evidence-based. And I'm also a public health physician, so I know that the prevention strategies and the resources that we spend now will pay enormous dividends, but they will pay those dividends in a much longer term than what we typically see in our election cycle. So what we should do now is we should be super brave. We should be super brave to resource the interventions and the evidence that we know works. We should be brave to resource our Māori and our Pacific providers to support those people that are experiencing severe housing deprivation. And as you discussed, the definition of homelessness in Aotearoa, New Zealand is super broad. So while we might see a reduction in an on the street count, and actually we're not seeing that, what we're not seeing what we're not measuring is the hidden homelessness. We need to really keep our eye on the ball to understand where have people who are no longer eligible for emergency housing, where have they gone? If we're going to say that we're succeeding in reducing the enormous cost and strain of the experience of homelessness in our communities, then we need to be measuring it accurately, and we need to be able to adapt and support the processes that we know work.
We've got some numbers, just finally, Polly, because I know you need to get away shortly, but we've got some numbers today from Stats NZ on child poverty, the annual child poverty stats, which show that the number of children experiencing material hardship has increased in the last year, and over the last 3 years has increased from around 12% of all children living with material hardship now to 14.3%. One of the interesting things about this move on order is it applies to people over the age of 14.
Yeah.
What about this issue of homelessness, the move on orders for 14-year-olds and our child poverty crisis?
Yeah, look, absolutely. And when you said what should we do, being brave to eliminate child poverty and to actually speak to those policies that we had in place to measure it well and to actually work on those strategies. We haven't seen much of a reduction, particularly in Māori and Pacific child poverty over the last 5 years or so. In fact, as you say, we're seeing increases. And we've done some research with rangatahi rangatahi with young people in collaboration with our partner organisations here in the Waikato and our rangatahi who were experiencing homelessness. What they told us to do is to take a strengths-based approach to reduce the incredibly complicated eligibility criteria across all of our services, to support them to have control over those decisions and to absolutely resource them appropriately. We shouldn't really be making it so difficult for those that are experiencing the stress and strain of severe housing deprivation to really understand, how am I going to make this work? How am I going to feed my children? How am I going to pay that rent? What can I do when I can't pay that rent? Because actually what they have to do now is get another loan from the government that increases the debt. It's another tipping point. Yeah, absolutely. Child poverty, prevention of all of those aspects of trauma that are experienced by our really critical community members who are also experiencing severe housing deprivation has to be part of our BRAVE strategy.
Thank you very much. Associate Professor Polly Atatoa from the Te Naira Institute for Population Research at Waikato University. Thanks very much for coming on the Hoon, Polly.
Thank you, Polly.
Kia ora. You're welcome.
Kia ora.
So
Kia
I
te.
thought that one of the most interesting things from Polly there, Bernard, was the gigantic stick backwards. It is an interesting thing, isn't it? The challenge between progressive thinking, small p, and the challenge with retrospective thinking, reactionary thinking. Often people confuse the difference between reactive and reactionary, but this is really a reactionary policy.
Yeah, and it's deliberately reactionary. So this announcement, it wasn't something that sort of dribbled out. This is a Sunday special. When I say Sunday special, in Wellington Politico belt terms, when a government, which has the power to set the agenda with announcements, wants to do it and they want to get the biggest possible audience, they do it on a Sunday afternoon. You take a lot of the critical reporters out of the process because they're not working on a Sunday. So you get a very relatively small number of reporters covering it. You get the evening TV shows. The Sunday shows have the highest ratings of all of the TV shows. And so they've focus grouped this. They've gone around and said, if we kick down and blame the victim, what will you think of this? And the focus groups have come back and said, yeah, we don't like them either. We don't want to see them. We don't want them around us. We don't want them walking into the same stores as us.
Does David Farrow run the focus groups as well as the polling? I presume he does.
He has in the past. I don't know whether he's done that. And also I can't confirm that there has been a focus group on this particular issue. Yeah. But when you have big announcements like this, particularly ones which, they can go both ways. It's not clearly a positive thing. There'd be a bunch of people who aren't happy clearly about it. But there are some who are happy. And often they're the swinging voters in the suburbs who often may not go into these CBDs very often, but when they do, they notice this, and also you've got a lot of people in business, and it was interesting this week. One of the angles that Christopher Luxon used to justify the move on orders was to say it wasn't a good look for our foreign visitors, the cruise ships, the Chuck and Marys, as he described them.
Did he call them Chuck and Mary? Because I think I just said Frankie and Mabel or something. I couldn't quite. But it did conjure the impression of people in Hawaiian shirts with with cameras dangling around their necks, like the 1950s. Yeah.
Yeah, and what he was essentially saying there is, it's a bad look. I don't want to see it. Well, that's one way to approach it, to essentially pretend that it's not there. But he needs to look at the child poverty stats that came out today to see how huge. And we've got 14% of the country's children living in material hardship. We're a modern, rich
we're not. This
country.
is the trouble. We're not, Bernard. I think, and the ghastly people that I follow on X who were talking about that thing I mentioned at the beginning about Parliament are welcoming this. And then when I took one of them on about something this week, they said, "Don't you understand about individual responsibility?" And that Maori and Pacifica people who are overrepresented in homelessness and so on. It's all about moral. It's all about individual responsibility, and that plays very well to a certain audience. It's what ACT says. It's what National says, and to some extent, it's what New Zealand First is saying. In fact, they're saying it louder than anybody.
It's really interesting, though. There was a survey that came out a couple of months ago looking at what the various party voters think about public housing support. Interestingly, 82% of New Zealand First voters think that the government should be building more state houses. 64% of ACT voters think that the
Gosh,
government should be
that's
building more
yeah.
houses. And so I think the government misjudges how, I mean, sure, there's an 18% who oppose it, but and they will be some of the floating voters that the government's trying to pull back from ACT and New Zealand First. Remember, this is a defensive move. This isn't so much about winning over Liberal voters from Labor or the Greens. They're trying to shuffle the vote within the centre-right bloc, because at the moment the centre-right bloc is, according to the trend measures, likely to win the election. And of course, it's not so much about whether you win, it's about how big your vote is in the new coalition. And of course, the National want to avoid a situation where not only is the tail wagging the dog, but the tail gets bigger in the November 7th election. So we'll see how that goes. It's been a quite a dispiriting week on that front, but the pushback that the government is getting from all sorts of parts of society is very interesting and
Bernard,
quite strong.
I don't think you've been down to Wellington for a little while, certainly not into the Beehive, but or the gallery. But what's your sense about Christopher Luxon's current position? Is the strength or otherwise of him relative to the two people jockeying underneath him all the time?
Yeah, well, since the start of the year, his popularity has fallen again. He's at record low popularity for his own track, if you like, in terms of net unpopularity. He is as unpopular as David Seymour and the Te Pāti Māori's co-leader, Debbie Ngārewa Paka, to give you a sense of, with broad New Zealand, how popular he is. The trouble for the National Party is that if they were to dump him 9 months out from an election, 8 months, 6 months, 7 months, it looks like chaos. And for a Conservative Party whose one, major argument for staying in power is that we are the stable, the sensible ones, the common sense types who will keep the Greens and Te Pāti Māori
the natural party of government. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. And so, and they've been through multiple leadership changes in the reasonably recent past enough to know that that's difficult. And currently, the polls say not only have they got a good chance of winning, now it may not be with as many national MPs in the mix, but still winning and still being in government, that they don't want to rock the boat too much. And as I said last week, I think that it's interesting that both of the major parties are falling in popularity. And it's unusual at this point in the electoral cycle, particularly after a year in which New Zealand First have been in government, that New Zealand First is actually more popular than at the start of their time in government. Usually it's the other way around. And this time, New Zealand First, and according to the most recent poll that came out earlier this week, is now significantly over 10% in the polls. It's pushing the migration buttons. It's pushing the anti-woke buttons. And it's working so far for New Zealand First, and National will be wary of that they don't get run down in the home straight by New Zealand First and ACT, as we've seen in the UK. Reform, it ran down the Conservatives.
Coming up the outside rail.
Yep. And actually in Australia, the same thing is happening, where shockingly this week we got a poll result from New South Wales showing that Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party is now the most popular party in New South Wales politics.
Thank you, Rupert Murdoch and Sky Australia.
Exactly.
And also in the UK at the moment, you've got this other ludicrous organisation, Reclaim, I think it's called, which Elon Musk is now backing. And it's far to the right of reform. It's pretty, his interventions in all sorts of markets is pretty extraordinary. And just to slightly go back to the X thing, I noticed that Drew Pavlu, who was a agitator in Australia who's been very strong on the reasons behind the Bondi massacre and so on, plus a truly ghastly American called Dinesh D'Souza, who is very far right, both started focusing on New Zealand this week. And I think it's been triggered by this anger, if you like, or theatrical anger about blocking the Parliament deciding not to, the parliamentary clerk deciding not to contribute to it.
Really?
Bernard, shall we do a quick skateboarding dog before we go?
Yes, please. If
I've
you've
got one.
got
Now,
one.
I just have to read it on the chat on here. So just let me make sure I can do that and you can still hear me. Can you still hear me?
I can. Yep.
Excellent. So the story is from Sweden, and 5 people have been rescued from an ice floe carrying a sauna tent, a motorized saw, and an onboard motor after they lost control of their DIY vessel in the Stockholm archipelago. Swedish authorities believe the passengers, who were German tourists, had been attempting to create their own motor-powered floating sauna when the swell from a passing passenger ferry broke the piece of ice and stranded them. Bemused passengers on the ferry watched as the 5 figures stood in sub-zero temperatures on the disintegrating narrow piece of ice, surrounded by water against a backdrop of snow-covered rocks and pine trees. There we go. And it's sort of in a slightly...
Were they naked? That was the question I had.
No, I don't think they'd finished the sauna yet, but in a slightly horrible version of that. And I was going to ask Catherine this. There's a alarming story out today about the mass deaths of emperor penguins who have to stay on the ice floes to molt. And unfortunately, the ice floes are melting in the Antarctic, and too many of them are drowning, the poor little buggers.
Oh, no.
Big buggers, actually. Sorry.
Yeah.
Big sodomites.
What a world we live in. And it's not
do.
going to get calmer in the next week. We could have a war in Iran. It could be something going on in Cuba, who've just shot a bunch of Americans who happen to be sailing or fizz boating into Cuba. Shot them. So the latest story is Cuban soldiers shot dead 4 Americans who were on a speedboat attempting to infiltrate the country. And we haven't seen a response yet from Trump.
Well,
or
I think we'll see that fairly shortly.
Yeah. So it's not going to be a calm weekend. We'll be back again next week with the Hoon. I'm Bernard Hickey. Thanks to Peter Bale, who's in the kaka, on the kaka. And
it's goodbye from him and goodbye from me.
From me. Ka kite anō. Bye-bye.
See you, Bernard. Thank you very much. And thank you, Simon.